Milk River Valley, Montana Territory, November 1886. When Lars Ericsson announced he would winter in a hole beneath a cottonwood tree, the settlement at Fort Benton considered it a death sentence. Experienced trappers gave him until January. The county surveyor bet $2 silver he'd abandon it by Christmas. His own brother-in-law called it Norwegian madness, a desperate man's grave dug by his own hands. But on February 3, 1887, when temperatures plunged to 31 degrees below zero and 3 families lost fingers to frostbite in their proper log cabins, Lars Ericsson emerged from his tree pit shelter in his shirt sleeves. His thermometer read 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The cabins that mocked him measured -1. 35 degrees warmer, half the firewood, and a question that would haunt Fort Benton's master builders for years. What did this immigrant understand about heat and earth that they had forgotten? Fort Benton prided itself on practical men. By 1886, the settlement had survived 2 decades of Montana winters through proven methods. Tight-chinked log cabins, stone fireplaces drawing 16 inches wide, and cord upon cord of split cottonwood. A man who deviated from these standards wasn't pioneering, he was suicidal. Lars Ericsson deviated spectacularly. He arrived in September with a worn geological survey map, a Norwegian carpentry manual, and a theory the locals found incomprehensible. While neighboring homesteaders felled lodgepole pines and notched corners, Lars walked the Milk River bottomland examining cottonwood root systems. While they raised walls, he dug downward. By October, he had excavated a pit 8 feet deep and 12 feet across, centered on a massive cottonwood whose roots sprawled 40 feet in every direction. "He's building a root cellar to live in," laughed Samuel Bridger, a cabin builder with 11 Montana winters behind him. "Might as well bed down with the potatoes." The settlement's blacksmith was less mused. "That Scandinavian's gonna freeze solid as an anvil," he predicted to anyone who'd listen. "Come spring, we'll chip him out in pieces." What mystified Fort Benton wasn't just the hole, it was Lars's systematic refusal of their help. When Bridger offered to teach him proper corner notching, Lars politely declined. When the Presbyterian minister's wife brought quilts for adequate insulation, Lars thanked her and returned them, explaining he had other methods. The surveyor, William Cobb, watched Lars line the pit's lower 4 feet with river cobbles and declared it the work of a man who's lost his reason. The technical explanation Lars offered made things worse. He spoke of earth as thermal battery, of root-stabilized walls preventing collapse, of convective loops and radiant barriers. In 1886 Montana, such language sounded like sorcery. Men built with logs, stone, and muscle. They understood chimneys drew because hot air rose. They knew thick walls kept wind out. But this talk of earth storing summer heat, of roots creating natural buttressing, of positioning entrances to trap warm air, it seemed like Norwegian superstition dressed in technical words. "If living underground was smart, we'd all be prairie dogs," Cobb argued at the general store. By November, Lars had framed a low roof structure over his pit using cottonwood branches and saplings. He covered this with 18 inches of sod, cut from the riverbank, roots interlaced like woven fabric. The entry, barely 4 feet high, descended at a 30-degree angle, creating what he called a cold trap. Above ground, the structure looked like a grass-covered mound with a stovepipe emerging near the cottonwood trunk. It resembled nothing so much as a burial cairn. The mockery intensified. Children dared each other to peek into the troll hole. Adults made grim jokes about Ericsson's folly becoming Ericsson's tomb. The settlement placed informal wagers on his survival, not whether he'd make it through winter, but how many weeks before he came crawling to a real cabin, frostbitten and humbled. What none of them understood, what Lars barely explained because he knew they wouldn't listen, was that he wasn't improvising. He was replicating a design perfected over centuries in Nordic earth-sheltered structures and refined by Hidatsa earth lodges he'd studied during his survey work in Dakota Territory. The cottonwood wasn't decorative. Its root system, penetrating 8 feet deep and radiating outward, created a natural stabilization matrix that prevented wall collapse while allowing moisture drainage. The river cobbles weren't foundation, they were thermal mass. Stones that would absorb daytime heat from his small sheet iron stove and radiate it for hours after the fire died. But technical explanations meant nothing to men who measured wisdom by tradition. Samuel Bridger had built cabins the same way his father taught him. William Cobb trusted engineering books from Philadelphia, not theories from immigrant homesteaders. The Presbyterian minister believed providence favored the righteous, and righteousness meant following established methods, not burrowing like an animal. On November 12th, the first serious snow fell, 8 inches overnight. Smoke rose from every cabin chimney by dawn, great plumes of cottonwood smoke as families stoked fires against the cold. From Lars Eriksson's mound, a thin wisp emerged, barely visible. By mid-morning, it had stopped entirely. "He's already out of firewood," someone observed. "Or dead," another replied. Neither was true. Lars was sitting comfortably at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, reading by the light of a single tallow candle. His fire had burned for 90 minutes that morning, just long enough to heat the river cobbles lining his pit. Now, 6 hours later, those stones were still radiating warmth into the space, assisted by the 8 feet of earth insulation surrounding him and the low ceiling that kept every BTU of heat at body level instead of rising uselessly toward roof peaks. But Fort Benton saw only the absent smoke and shook their heads. They gave him 2 more weeks. What Fort Benton dismissed as desperation was actually deliberation. Lars Eriksson hadn't stumbled into earth-sheltered living through poverty or madness. He had studied it, measured it, and chosen it with the precision of an engineer selecting the correct beam for a bridge. The knowledge came from 3 sources, each dismissed by 1886 Montana as primitive or irrelevant. First, his grandfather's farm outside Trondheim, Norway, where the root cellar maintained 45 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, 8 feet below ground, insulated by nothing more than earth and time. Lars had spent childhood winters in that space during his grandfather's clock-making work. The old man insisted stable temperature was essential for calibrating precision mechanisms. Young Lars had noted the paradox. The deeper they went, the less fire they needed. While the farmhouse above required constant feeding of the hearth, the underground workshop stayed comfortable with a single candle lamp and body heat. Second, his survey work in Dakota Territory in 1883, where he'd mapped Hidatsa village sites along the Missouri River. The earth lodges, 40 feet across, excavated 3 feet deep, framed with cottonwood and willow and sod, had sheltered families through plains winters that killed unprepared cavalry soldiers. The U.S. Army had called them savage dwellings, even as their own fort barracks froze solid. Lars had taken measurements, sketched cross-sections, interviewed the few remaining Hidatsa elders about heating strategies. They described fires that burned for only 2 hours each evening, yet maintained comfortable interior temperatures through prairie nights that reached 20 below zero. The secret, one elder explained through a translator, wasn't the fire's size, it was the Earth's memory. Ground remembers summer heat,
the old man had said, gesturing at the packed clay floor. Gives it back slowly, all winter long. Third, a geological survey document Lars had obtained in St. Paul, Minnesota. A dry technical paper on subsurface temperature gradients in the northern plains. The data was clear. At 8 feet depth, soil temperature remained relatively constant year-round, fluctuating only 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit compared to the 100-plus degree swings experienced at the surface.
In Montana, that meant Earth at 8 feet depth stayed between 45–50 degrees even when January air temperature plunged below zero. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were observable, measurable phenomena that Lars had documented in his survey notebooks with the precision of trained draftsmen. Temperature differentials, BTU calculations, thermal conductivity coefficients for various soil types. He knew that clay soil, like the riverbank deposits near Fort Benton, had a thermal conductivity of approximately 0.6 BTU per hour per square foot per degree Fahrenheit, meaning it transferred heat slowly, allowing it to store warmth accumulated during summer and early fall. But in November 1886, Lars kept these calculations to himself. Fort Benton wanted log cabins and stone chimneys. They wanted visible smoke and stacks of split wood. They wanted the architecture of civilization, not the engineering of Earth. So, he dug. The excavation had taken 3 weeks of careful work. 8 feet deep meant removing roughly 96 cubic yards of soil, about 130 tons, lifted one shovelful at a time. But Lars didn't just dig a hole, he shaped it, sloping the walls at 70 degrees to prevent collapse, compacting each foot of depth before proceeding deeper. The massive cottonwood tree he'd selected stood at the southern edge of his claim, its root system he estimated weighing 4 to 6 tons. Those roots created natural buttressing, spiderwebbing through the soil like organic rebar. When he hit the water table at 7.5 feet, he stopped. The bottom 18 inches he lined with river cobbles, each stone 6 to 10 pounds, selected for density and smoothness. Total weight, approximately 4,000 pounds of thermal mass. During construction, people assumed he was creating drainage. They were half right. The cobbles did allow water to percolate downward, preventing the pit from becoming a mud hole. But their primary function was heat storage. The framing structure was cottonwood, not because it was traditional, but because cottonwood's low density and high moisture content made it excellent insulation when dried. The branches he'd harvested in September had spent October air drying, losing 40% of their moisture content. Now they formed a dome framework 20 inches above the excavated floor, creating a space just tall enough for Lars to stand upright at the center. Over this frame, he laid willow lattice, then 18 inches of sod. The sod wasn't random chunks of prairie. Lars had cut it methodically from riverbank areas where reed canary grass roots formed dense mats. These root systems, interwoven over decades, created structural integrity. The sod walks, each roughly 12 by 18 inches and weighing 30 to 40 pounds, were stacked with roots interlocking, creating a living roof that would actually strengthen over time as the grass continued growing. Total roof weight, approximately 8 tons. The cottonwood frame and root-buttressed walls distributed this load across the pit's entire perimeter. Engineering texts from Philadelphia would have called it impossible. The structure held perfectly. The entry tunnel descended at 30 degrees over a distance of 8 feet, dropping 3 vertical feet below ground level before opening into the main chamber. This created a natural cold trap. Dense,
frigid air would settle in the entry passage, forming an insulating plug that prevented warm air from escaping the living space. No door was necessary. Physics provided the barrier. Inside, Lars had installed a small sheet iron stove, perhaps 18 inches square, vented through a 6-inch stovepipe that exited near the cottonwood trunk. The stove sat on a platform of additional river stones, surrounded by the 4,000-pound cobble floor. When fired, heat radiated in every direction, absorbed primarily by stone rather than air. This was the critical insight Fort Benton missed. A conventional cabin fireplace heated air, which immediately stratified, hot air rising, cold air settling. A log cabin with an 8-foot ceiling wasted tremendous energy, heating the upper 4 feet of space, where no one lived. Lars's Stelcher had a ceiling height of just 6 feet at the center, tapering to 4 feet at the edges. Every cubic foot of warmed air remained at body level. Total interior volume, approximately 450 cubic feet, compared to 1,200 plus cubic feet in a standard cabin. Less space required proportionally less energy to heat. The third principle was convection management. The entry tunnel's 30-degree descending angle created a natural thermal lock. Cold air, being denser than warm air, settled in the tunnel like water settling in a trap, creating a plug of frigid air that actually insulated the living space from outside conditions. Warm air from the shelter couldn't escape without somehow displacing this dense cold air mass, which it couldn't do because warm air rises rather than descending. The result? Zero air exchange unless Lars physically walked through the entry, temporarily disrupting the cold trap. Compare this to a log cabin, where every chink crack, every window frame, every door gap allowed continuous air infiltration. Fort Benton cabins had infiltration rates of 1 to 2 air changes per hour, meaning the entire interior air volume was replaced by freezing outdoor air every 30 to 60 minutes. Heating such a space was like pouring water into a leaking bucket. Lars's pit had essentially zero infiltration when he wasn't present. The only air exchange came from his small stovepipe and the minimal breathing ventilation required for human occupation, perhaps 15 cubic feet per hour. He wasn't heating Montana. He was heating 450 cubic feet of earth-insulated, thermally massive, convection-trapped space. The mathematics were brutal and precise. A conventional cabin, losing 1.5 air changes per hour in 10-degree weather, needed to heat 1,800 cubic feet of fresh outdoor air every 60 minutes, requiring approximately 18,000 BTUs per hour just to maintain indoor temperature at 45 degrees. That meant burning roughly 2 pounds of wood per hour, continuously, 16 hours per day. Over a month, nearly half a cord. Lars's shelter needed to heat only the thermal losses through 8 feet of earth insulation plus minimal ventilation air. His calculated heat loss, approximately 2,500 BTUs per hour. But he didn't need to supply all 2,500 BTUs. The Earth's baseline temperature of 47 to 48 degrees meant he only needed to add enough heat to raise interior temperature another 10 to 15 degrees to achieve comfort. Total heating requirement, roughly 1,000 BTUs per hour, averaged over 24 hours. Burning his small stove for 90 minutes per day, consuming perhaps 3 pounds of wood, generated approximately 12,000 BTUs. The river cobbles absorbed and stored this energy, releasing it gradually over the following 22.5 hours. The system worked because thermal mass decoupled heat generation from heat delivery. He could burn intensely for a short period, store the energy in stone, and withdraw it slowly over time. It was the same principle behind masonry heaters, Russian stoves, and Korean ondol systems. technologies that heated stone rather than air, achieving 70 to 80% efficiency compared to the 15 to 20% efficiency of open fireplaces. But Fort Benton didn't build Russian stoves. They built what they knew, and what they knew was wasteful. The cottonwood tree above added a final engineering element that Lars had deliberately selected for but rarely explained. The massive root system didn't just stabilize walls, it acted as a thermal moderator. Tree roots, even dormant in winter, contained moisture and cellular structure that moderated temperature extremes. The network of roots threading through the earthen walls absorbed excess heat during the brief periods when Lars's stove was burning, then released it gradually, creating additional thermal buffering. It was a living component in a living system. By mid-December, Lars Ericsson had burned through exactly 1/8 of a cord, roughly 16 cubic feet of split cottonwood. His interior temperature ranged between 48 degrees, morning, before firing the stove, and 58 degrees, evening after the 90-minute burn. He wore a single wool shirt indoors. His water bucket never froze. Samuel Bridger, in his properly built cabin, had burned through 4 cords. His interior temperature ranged between 38 degrees, morning with dead fire, and 52 degrees, evening standing directly beside active fireplace. He wore 2 shirts, a vest, and a coat indoors. His water bucket froze solid every night unless placed within 3 feet of the hearth. But Bridger didn't know these numbers. No one did. They saw Lars walking to the general store in a single jacket while they bundled in furs. They noticed his weekly wood consumption seemed absurdly small. But they attributed this to Norwegian hardiness or perhaps secret suffering he refused to admit. The possibility that he had engineered a superior solution never seriously occurred to them. Superior solutions came from universities and engineering firms, not from immigrants digging holes. The hierarchy of knowledge was clear. Educated men designed, practical men built, and desperate men improvised. Lars was categorized as desperate, therefore his methods were improvisation, therefore they would eventually fail. On December 19th, when William Cobb stopped by Lars's mound to check if he was still alive, he found Lars sitting on a cottonwood stump stool reading a book by lantern light, in his shirt sleeves. The surveyor descended the entry tunnel reluctantly, as if visiting a sick ward, and stopped, confused. "It's warm in here," he said, sounding almost accusatory. 49 degrees, Lars confirmed, gesturing at his thermometer. Cobb looked around the dim space, the stone floor, the low ceiling, the tiny sheet iron stove with no fire burning. How? Lars considered explaining thermal mass, radiant heat storage, convective isolation, earth insulation constants. Then he looked at Cobb's face, skeptical, uncomfortable, already preparing to dismiss whatever explanation followed, and simply said, "The earth remembers summer." Cobb shook his head and climbed back out. At the general store an hour later, he reported, "Ericsson is surviving somehow, says the earth remembers summer. Complete nonsense, obviously. Norwegian folk wisdom. He'll freeze when the real cold comes." The real cold was 3 weeks away. January 1887 arrived with deceptive gentleness. The first week brought temperatures in the mid-20s, cold enough to require fires, but not brutal. Fort Benton burned wood steadily and congratulated themselves on adequate preparation. Some families had even begun suggesting that maybe this wouldn't be a harsh winter after all. Then January 12th arrived. The temperature at sunrise measured 8 degrees Fahrenheit. It had fallen to 2 degrees by noon. By 4 p.m., -7. The sky was crystalline clear, stars visible even before sunset, the kind of clarity that presages extreme cold because it meant no cloud cover, no thermal blanket, just endless radiation of heat into the infinite cold of space. By 8 p.m., William Cobb's thermometer outside the surveyor's office read -18 degrees Fahrenheit. It would fall another 13 degrees before dawn. The cold was unlike anything Montana had delivered in 5 years. It was the kind of cold that made breath crystallize instantly, that turned exposed skin white in seconds, and that caused improperly dried firewood to crack explosively in hearths. It was survival cold, the kind that killed. Fort Benton responded the only way it knew, with fire. Every cabin burned flames 6 feet high. Fireplaces roared continuously, fed with split cottonwood at a rate that consumed a week's supply in a single night. Families huddled within arm's reach of the hearths, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, watching frost form on interior walls despite the flames. Samuel Bridger's cabin, considered one of the best built in the settlement, maintained an interior temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. Despite a fire so intense it was dangerous to stand within 5 feet of it. The cabin's log walls, tight-chinked and well-constructed, simply couldn't compete with -31-degree exterior temperatures. The differential was too great, the infiltration too constant. Cold leaked through every crack, radiated through every log, invaded through the floor and roof. The cabin wasn't shelter, it was merely slower death than standing outside. By 2 a.m., Bridger's 10-year-old daughter showed signs of frostbite on her fingers, despite wearing mittens and sitting 4 feet from the fire. His wife wrapped the child in their last spare blanket and held her. But hypothermia didn't require freezing temperatures. It only required sustained cold.
At 28 degrees interior temperature, with no warm place to properly rest, the body's core temperature would gradually decline even while technically above freezing. In the surveyor's office, William Cobb fed his stove until it glowed dull red, dangerous to touch. His interior temperature, 22 degrees. He began to seriously consider whether he should wake his neighbors and organize everyone into the general store, where combined body heat and fires might keep people alive until dawn. At 3:17 a.m., the settlement's thermometer recorded -31 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 feet underground, Lars Eriksson slept comfortably under a single wool blanket. His thermometer, hung on the low ceiling where he could see it by lantern light, read 34 degrees Fahrenheit. He had fired his stove at 6 p.m. the previous evening, burning it for 90 minutes as usual. The river cobbles had absorbed the heat. Now, 9.5 hours later, they were still radiating warmth into the 450 cubic foot space, assisted by the 260 tons of earth insulation that separated him from the surface catastrophe. The earth didn't care what the air above was doing. 8 feet down, thermal inertia ruled, and thermal inertia held steady at 47 degrees baseline. Lars's small addition of heat, already stored in stone, brought interior temperature to the low 30s. 34 degrees wasn't warm by summer standards, but 34 degrees was 65 degrees warmer than the exterior air. It was 6 degrees warmer than Samuel Bridger's fire-scorched cabin. It was 12 degrees warmer than William Cobb's glowing stove room. And Lars had achieved it by burning 3 pounds of wood 9 hours earlier. The temperature differential wasn't trivial. It was life and death. At 28 degrees, exposed skin could develop frostbite within hours. At 34 degrees, no such risk existed. At 28 degrees, sustained exposure led to hypothermia. At 34 degrees, the body maintained core temperature indefinitely. The 6-degree difference between Bridger's cabin and Lars's pit was the difference between surviving and thriving. But no one knew. Fort Benton was fighting for survival in their individual cabins, burning furniture when firewood ran low,
making desperate calculations about whether their supply would last until dawn. The idea of walking out into -31-degree darkness to check on the crazy Norwegian who lived in a hole was unthinkable. Dawn arrived at 7:23 a.m. with agonizing slowness. The temperature had moderated slightly, -28 degrees by sunrise, rising to -19 by 9 a.m. Fort Benton emerged from their cabins like refugees from war, exhausted from sleepless nights of fire tending, faces haggard, fingers tingling with near frostbite. Samuel Bridger had burned through 2 weeks of wood supply in a single night. His daughter's fingers were swollen and painful, but probably not permanently damaged. His wife had developed a persistent cough from breathing superheated, smoke-tinged air for 12 hours straight. Their cabin walls were covered in a 1/4 inch of interior frost, condensation from breath and fire that had frozen solid against the logs. William Cobb found 3 families at the general store, having abandoned their cabins in the pre-dawn hours when interior temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. They had huddled together in the store, burning its inventory of kindling to stay alive. The Presbyterian minister led a prayer service at 10 a.m., thanking Providence for their survival. 17 people attended, frostbitten and exhausted. The minister specifically prayed for Lars Ericsson, who surely perished in the night, that his soul might find warmth in heaven that earth denied him. At 10:30 a.m., Lars Ericsson walked into the general store. He wore a single wool jacket, his usual work boots, and no hat. His face was healthy pink, his hands steady and warm, his breath even and unlabored. He nodded politely to the assembled survivors, set 2 coins on the counter, and asked for a pound of arbuckles. The store went silent. "You," William Cobb finally managed, "you made it through the night." "Yes," Lars confirmed, puzzled by the statement's obviousness. "In that pit of yours?" "Yes." "How cold was it?" someone asked. "Inside?" Lars considered. "I didn't measure at the coldest point, but this morning before I lit the stove, perhaps 32 or 33 degrees. The number hung in the air like an accusation. "That's impossible," Bridger said flatly. "My cabin was 28 degrees with a fire burning all night. You're saying your hole was warmer without fire?" "The stones retain heat," Lars explained patiently. "I burned the stove yesterday evening. The stones released that heat through the night, plus the earth insulation." "How much wood did you burn?" Cobb interrupted. "Yesterday, 3 pounds, approximately, same as usual." 3 pounds! Bridger had burned roughly 400 pounds, an eighth of a cord in the same period. Someone laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "You're a liar or a fool." Lars set his coffee on the counter carefully. "Bring a thermometer. Come measure for yourself." An hour later, 6 men descended into Lars Ericsson's tree pit shelter. William Cobb with his surveyor's thermometer, Samuel Bridger, the blacksmith, the general store owner, and 2 trappers who claimed they knew cold better than any Norwegian. The entry tunnel was narrow and awkward, designed, Lars explained, to trap cold air and prevent convection. They emerged into the dim, low-ceiling space, hunched to avoid the ceiling. Cobb held up his thermometer, waited, read it twice to be certain. 36 degrees, he announced. The men looked around slowly, comprehending what they were seeing for the first time. The stone floor, smooth, dry, slightly warm to the touch. The absence of frost on any surface. The tiny sheet iron stove not even lit. "Touch the stones," Lars suggested. The blacksmith knelt, placed his palm flat on the river cobbles, smashed it back as if burned. "They're hot." "Warm," Lars corrected. "Perhaps 90 degrees. They've been cooling for 13 hours, but they still have heat stored from yesterday's fire." Bridger crouched, running calculations in his head. How much heat is in these stones?
4,000 pounds of stone, Lars said, raised perhaps 50 degrees above ambient Earth temperature. That represents about 40,000 BTUs of stored energy, roughly equivalent to burning 4 pounds of wood. It releases slowly over 10 to 12 hours. The trappers examined the entry tunnel, the way it descended, the pool of dense cold air they'd pushed through to enter. One of them, a French-Canadian who'd spent 20 winters on the northern frontier, nodded slowly. Cold lock, he said. Métis earth lodges used similar, very old knowledge. Cobb was staring at his thermometer as if it had betrayed him. Last night, in my office, I burned wood continuously for 12 hours. I measured 22 degrees inside. You burned wood for 90 minutes yesterday evening and measured 36 degrees this morning. The Earth is insulation, Lars said simply. The stones are storage. The design is merely deliberate. The silence stretched as 6 men confronted a reality that contradicted everything they'd built. They'd mocked this immigrant for digging a hole. They'd called him foolish, primitive, doomed. They'd bet money on his failure. And he'd survived the coldest night in 5 years, burning 1/100th the wood they had, while maintaining warmer interior temperatures than their finest cabins. Samuel Bridger finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Can you teach us to build these?" Lars looked at him, at the exhaustion, the frostbitten fingers, the genuine need. "Of course," he said, "but it's already January. Earth is frozen now. You'd need to wait for spring thaw to excavate properly. How long does excavation take? 3 weeks for one person, 1 week if 3 people work together, then another week for framing and covering." The blacksmith was running different calculations. How many could shelter in a space like this? 2 people comfortably, 4 in emergency. The principle scales. Larger pit, more thermal mass, but the mathematics remain consistent.
The general store owner asked the question everyone was thinking. Why didn't you tell us before winter? Why let us think you were crazy? Lars's expression was patient but pointed. I explained thermal mass, earth insulation, convective isolation. I was called primitive. I offered to show the survey documents, the Hidatsa Lodge measurements. I was told I didn't understand Montana winters. He paused. You didn't want to listen. You wanted to believe your way was the only way. No one argued. The thermometer on Cobb's hand still read 36 degrees. Their cabins, expensive, laboriously constructed, filled with smoke and frost, read 20 degrees warmer than outside air. Lars's pit, dug by hand, built with stones and sod, read 67 degrees warmer than outside air. The evidence wasn't ambiguous. The temperature data collected over the following 2 weeks transformed Fort Benton's understanding of shelter, heat, and engineering hierarchy. William Cobb, trained surveyor and man of science, couldn't argue with measurements. He placed thermometers in 4 locations: his own office, Samuel Bridger's cabin, the general store, and Lars Eriksson's tree pit shelter. He recorded readings at sunrise, noon, and sunset for 14 consecutive days. The numbers were devastating to conventional wisdom. January 13th through January 26th brought sustained cold. Nighttime temperatures averaging -12 degrees Fahrenheit, daytime highs reaching only 8 degrees. Perfect conditions for comparative thermal analysis, Cobb noted grimly in his survey journal. Bridger's cabin, despite burning an average of 18 pounds of wood per day, carefully split, properly dried cottonwood, maintained interior temperatures ranging from 31 degrees, sunrise, fire banked overnight, to 48 degrees, evening with active fire. The daily average? 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Total wood consumption over 14 days? 252 pounds, roughly 1/5 of a cord. Cobb's own office, with its cast iron stove running 12 to 14 hours daily, performed slightly better. 34 degrees at sunrise,
52 degrees at peak heating. Daily average, 42 degrees. Wood consumption, 196 pounds over 14 days. His stove was smaller, more efficient than an open fireplace, but still required near-constant feeding. The general store, benefiting from larger thermal mass, more interior furnishings, thicker walls, multiple occupants, and a substantial masonry stove, achieved 38 degrees at sunrise and 56 degrees during business hours. Daily average, 46 degrees. Wood consumption, 224 pounds over 14 days. Lars Eriksson's tree pit shelter, burning his small sheet iron stove for 90 minutes each evening, recorded temperatures of 32 degrees at sunrise, before daily firing, and 58 degrees at peak, 2 hours after firing. Daily average, 41 degrees. Virtually identical to Cobb's office, despite burning dramatically less fuel. Total wood consumption over 14 days, 42 pounds. 42 pounds versus 196. 42 pounds versus 224. 42 pounds versus 252. The efficiency differential wasn't marginal, it was revolutionary. Lars was achieving comparable interior temperatures while burning 78% to 83% less wood than the settlement's best-performing structures. But the numbers revealed something even more significant than fuel economy. They revealed thermal stability. Conventional cabins experienced wild temperature swings, 22-degree differentials between night and day, requiring constant human intervention to maintain marginal comfort. Lars's pit varied only 26 degrees, peak to trough, and most of that variation was deliberate, his evening fire raising temperature into the comfortable range for sleeping. The space self-regulated through thermal mass, requiring only a single daily heat input to maintain livable conditions. Samuel Bridger spent his 14-day test period waking every 2 hours throughout the night to add wood to his fire.
His wife developed chronic exhaustion. Their children complained constantly of cold feet, despite wearing multiple layers of socks. The family consumed meals standing near the fireplace, because sitting at the table meant enduring 35-degree temperatures. Lars Eriksson slept through every night uninterrupted. He wore a single wool shirt indoors. He ate meals comfortably seated at his small cottonwood table, reading by lantern light in his shirt sleeves. The difference wasn't just quantitative, it was qualitative. One system demanded constant vigilance and sacrifice. The other provided passive comfort through intelligent design. By January 27th, when Cobb presented his findings at an informal settlement meeting, the questions had shifted from "does it work?" to "how do we replicate this?" But replication wasn't simple. Lars explained the constraints carefully. Excavation required unfrozen ground, meaning construction could only begin after spring thaw, late April at the earliest in Montana. Site selection mattered critically: well-drained soil, proximity to suitable thermal mass materials, river stone, dense clay, and preferably a mature tree with extensive root system for structural stability. The work was labor-intensive, 3 weeks of digging for a single person, though collaborative effort could reduce this significantly. And the design required precision. Incorrect entry angle, insufficient thermal mass, or poor ventilation could transform an efficient shelter into a deadly trap. This isn't magic, Lars emphasized. It's engineering that requires understanding heat, earth, and water. Build incorrectly, and you create a grave. The settlement's blacksmith, a practical man named Thomas Hewitt, asked the critical question: what about existing cabins? Can we retrofit? Add thermal mass? Improve insulation? Lars considered. Adding stone mass around existing fireplaces helps, perhaps 20% efficiency improvement.
Banking earth against exterior walls provides additional insulation, another 10 to 15% fuel reduction. But the fundamental issue remains. You're heating large volumes of air in spaces with high infiltration rates. The architecture works against you. "So we abandon our cabins?" someone asked, sounding almost offended. "No," Lars said patiently. "You improve what you have for now. You learn principles. And when you build next, whether earth shelter or modified cabin, you build with thermal mass, convection control, and insulation designed from the beginning, not added as an afterthought." The conversation that followed revealed something unexpected. Lars Ericsson wasn't just a survivor of Fort Benton's mockery. He was, quietly, a teacher willing to share knowledge that tradition-bound builders had dismissed as primitive superstition. Over the next week, 17 men visited his tree pit shelter to take measurements, ask questions, and sketch diagrams in notebooks. Lars explained thermal conductivity, demonstrated cold trap function, calculated heat storage per pound of stone versus pound of wood. He showed his Norwegian carpentry manual, printed in 1871, containing tables for earth insulation values and thermal coefficients. He shared his Hidatsa Earth Lodge sketches from Dakota Territory, pointing out similarities and innovations. The French-Canadian trapper, a man named Henri Deschamps, who'd spent 30 winters in the Northern Territories, brought additional knowledge. He described Métis earth lodges along the Red River, Inuit Carmite partially dug into permafrost, and Athabascan semi-subterranean structures in Alaska. "This isn't Norwegian secret," Deschamps said, gesturing at Lars's shelter. "This is human knowledge, practiced wherever earth and cold meet. We forgot it when we decided above ground was civilized." The settlement's perspective began shifting, not universally, but perceptibly. The younger men, those who hadn't yet invested heavily in traditional construction, saw earth shelter design as practical innovation. Some older builders remained skeptical, attributing Lars's success to personal hardiness or unusual circumstances rather than replicable engineering. But even the skeptics couldn't argue with Cobb's temperature data or Lars's wood consumption records. By February, Fort Benton had divided into 3 camps: enthusiasts who planned earth-sheltered construction come spring, pragmatists who would retrofit existing cabins with lessons learned from Lars's design, and traditionalists who believed log cabins remained superior despite contrary evidence, citing aesthetics, status, and proper architecture. But even the traditionalists made one quiet concession. They stopped calling Lars Ericsson crazy. The social transformation was subtler, but perhaps more significant than the technical one. Lars had arrived as an outsider, immigrant, bachelor, speaker of accented English, whose unconventional methods marked him as other. The settlement had categorized him as desperate, foolish, doomed. Now, post-crisis, he was respected. Men sought his opinion. Families invited him to Sunday dinners. William Cobb, the surveyor who declared his methods impossible, publicly acknowledged, "I measured it myself. Ericsson's shelter performs exactly as he claimed. I was wrong to dismiss it." That admission, an educated professional conceding error to an immigrant laborer, represented something larger than one man's humility. It represented the beginning of Fort Benton's reckoning with its assumptions about knowledge, progress, and civilization. The settlers had believed that advancement meant rejecting old ways, that engineering came from universities and books, that living above ground was inherently superior to living within Earth. Lars Ericsson, with his hole in the ground and his river stones, had demonstrated that these beliefs were not facts but prejudices.
Effective engineering could be ancient or modern. Valuable knowledge could come from Norwegian grandfathers, Hidatsa elders, or geological surveys. Progress wasn't abandoning Earth, it was understanding Earth well enough to collaborate with it. By late February, 3 families had begun stockpiling river stones for spring construction projects. Samuel Bridger, who'd burned through 8.5 cords during the winter, nearly double his usual consumption, sketched plans for a semi-subterranean structure incorporating a corner stove surrounded by thermal mass. Not abandoning my cabin, he explained to neighbors, but building a winter shelter that doesn't require mortgage-level wood consumption. The blacksmith, Thomas Hewitt, proposed a community project, a shared earth lodge large enough to shelter multiple families during extreme cold events, built collaboratively in late spring, finished before next winter. Like a community root cellar, he explained, but for people instead of potatoes. The idea gained traction quickly. Fort Benton had survived January's -31-degree night, but several families had come dangerously close to disaster. A community emergency shelter, costing only labor and locally available materials, represented cheap insurance against future catastrophe. Lars agreed to provide technical guidance for the project. He would not supervise. These were capable men who could build once they understood principles. But he would answer questions, review plans, and help calculate thermal mass requirements based on occupancy. The settlement that had mocked him 6 months earlier now turned to him for knowledge. The hole they'd called a grave had become a proof of concept. The Norwegian they'd dismissed as primitive had become Fort Benton's unexpected teacher in the ancient art of working with earth instead of against it. And the wood he didn't burn, the cords saved through intelligent design, represented not just economic efficiency, but a deeper principle, that the best engineering often requires less, not more. Less fuel, less complexity, less fighting against the environment, and more understanding of how physical laws could be channeled rather than overcome. By March 1, 1887, when temperatures finally moderated into the 20s and 30s, Fort Benton had learned something that universities rarely taught, and frontier tradition often forgot: that dismissing knowledge based on its source, whether immigrant, indigenous, or ancient, was an act of arrogance that winter would eventually punish. The thermometer didn't care about hierarchy. It measured only heat and cold.
And in that measurement, Lars Eriksson's earth-embracing design had defeated Fort Benton's sky-reaching cabins with numbers too clear to deny. Spring arrived reluctantly in Montana Territory. The first ground thaw came in mid-April 1887, turning Fort Benton streets into rivers of mud and revealing what winter had hidden. 3 cabins with structural damage from frost heave, 2 collapsed roof sections from ice accumulation, and widespread chinking failure requiring complete remortaring. The settlement faced substantial repair costs before building season could even begin. Lars Eriksson's tree pit shelter emerged from winter unchanged. The sod roof, far from degrading, had strengthened as reed canary grass roots continued growing. The entry tunnel showed no frost damage. The interior remained dry, stable, and structurally sound. Total maintenance required? None. This final comparison, durability versus deterioration, completed Fort Benton's education. Efficient heating mattered, but so did structural integrity. Lars's design had proven superior on both counts. By May 1st, 11 men were actively excavating earth-sheltered structures. 3 were pure replications of Lars's design. 8-foot-deep pits centered on mature cottonwood trees, lined with river stone, covered with sod. 5 were hybrid designs: partial excavation, 4 to 5 feet, combined with raised earthen berms, creating semi-subterranean spaces that required less digging while maintaining substantial earth insulation. 3 were experimental, full basements beneath planned cabin structures, using earth sheltering principles to create winter living spaces below conventional above-ground rooms. The Community Earth Lodge, Thomas Hewitt's proposal, began construction on May 15th with 14 men working collaboratively. The design was ambitious. A circular excavation 24 feet in diameter and 6 feet deep, capable of sheltering 30 people during extreme cold events. The center would have a large masonry stove surrounded by 8,000 pounds of river stone, double Lars's thermal mass, scaled for higher occupancy. Cottonwood post and beam framing would support a domed sod roof 30 inches thick. Estimated construction time, 6 weeks of coordinated labor. Lars provided technical oversight but deliberately avoided authoritarian control. "I know one design that works. You're creating something larger. Experiment, measure, adjust. This is how knowledge advances." The collaborative construction became a learning laboratory. Men discovered that clay-rich soil, moistened and compacted, created superior wall surfaces compared to raw excavated earth. Smoother, more durable, slightly better insulation. They found that layering the sod roof, first willow lattice, then sod, then additional loose earth, then final sod layer, provided better drainage and insulation than single-layer sod alone. They learned that ventilation required careful calculation. Too little caused condensation and air quality problems. Too much destroyed thermal efficiency. Problems emerged and were solved collectively. Initial entry tunnel design created turbulent airflow that disrupted the cold trap. They redesigned it with a gentler descending angle and added a baffle wall. The first attempt at stove placement resulted in uneven heat distribution. They repositioned it and added a stone apron that better distributed radiant warmth. The willow lattice sagged under sod's weight. They reinforced the cottonwood framing and reduced span distances. By early July, the Community Earth Lodge was complete. Interior temperature on a 78-degree summer afternoon was 61 degrees, cooler than outside, demonstrating that earth insulation moderated heat in both directions. The structure awaited winter testing, but confidence was high. Fort Benton had built something genuinely innovative by combining Norwegian, indigenous, and practical experimental knowledge into a design that belonged to no single tradition, but drew from many. Samuel Bridger completed his semi-subterranean winter shelter in August. 4 feet of excavation, walls rising 3 feet above grade, heavy sod roof, corner stove surrounded by stone mass.
It wasn't as thermally efficient as full earth sheltering, but it represented 60% of the benefit for 40% of the labor. For a family man with existing cabin infrastructure, it was practical compromise. He kept his original cabin for spring, summer, and fall occupation, planning to move into the earth shelter only during severe winter cold. This hybrid approach, seasonal migration between structures optimized for different conditions, became common in Fort Benton. By October 1887, 7 families had completed similar dual shelter arrangements. Rather than abandoning everything they knew, they were integrating new knowledge with existing resources. It was cultural evolution in real time. The winter of 1887-88 arrived as the test of collective learning. November brought typical cold, and Fort Benton responded with notably reduced anxiety. Families with earth shelters burned through autumn wood supplies slowly, confidently. The Community Earth Lodge remained empty but ready, a shared resource requiring no maintenance, consuming no fuel, waiting for crisis. Crisis arrived on January 6, 1888. Temperature plunged to minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit with sustained winds reaching 40 miles per hour. Not as cold as the previous year's extreme, but the wind created brutal chill factors that made outdoor exposure deadly within minutes. Fort Benton's response was organized rather than panicked. 11 families moved into the community earth lodge for the duration of the cold snap, bringing bedrolls and food supplies. The large masonry stove was fired for 3 hours in the evening, heating the 8,000 pounds of stone mass. Interior temperature stabilized at 42 degrees, cold but survivable, and far superior to attempting to heat individual cabins in 40-mile-per-hour winds that would have stripped heat faster than any fireplace could generate it. The community sheltering lasted 36 hours until the winds subsided and temperatures moderated. Total wood consumption? Approximately 60 pounds for the entire group, roughly 4 pounds per family. In individual cabins facing those conditions, each family would have burned 10 to 15 times that amount while achieving inferior comfort and safety. The elderly Presbyterian minister, who'd prayed for Lars Eriksson's soul 2 years earlier, spent those 36 hours in the Earth Lodge and emerged with a revised theology. "I believed providence favored those who built upward toward heaven," he said during the following Sunday's service. "I have learned that providence also favors those wise enough to learn from earth itself. God's wisdom is found in stone and soil, not just scripture." It was perhaps the most profound statement of Fort Benton's transformation, the acknowledgement that knowledge wasn't hierarchical, scriptural over practical, educated over experiential, modern over ancient, but contextual. The right knowledge for the right situation, regardless of its source or age. By 1888, Fort Benton's architectural landscape had transformed. 18 earth-sheltered structures dotted the settlement and surrounding homesteads. The community earth lodge sat silent, but maintained, ready for the next emergency. Several families had retrofitted existing cabins with stone thermal mass and improved insulation, achieving 30 to 40% fuel savings without complete reconstruction. And crucially, the settlement's collective knowledge base had expanded. Men who'd never heard of thermal mass or convective isolation now debated optimal stone-to-space ratios and entry tunnel geometries with the confidence of engineers. Lars Eriksson remained what he'd always been, a quiet Norwegian immigrant with a carpentry manual and a willingness to learn from anyone: grandfathers, indigenous elders, geological surveys, or practical experience. But Fort Benton's perception of him had fundamentally changed. He wasn't a lucky survivor or an eccentric who'd stumbled into success. He was a teacher who demonstrated that the best engineering often came from observing how physical laws actually worked, rather than assuming how they should work based on tradition. The broader lesson extended beyond heating technology. Fort Benton had learned, slowly, reluctantly, but genuinely, that dismissing knowledge based on its source was a form of willful ignorance that reality would eventually correct. Whether that knowledge came from Norwegian farmers, Hidatsa architects, French-Canadian trappers, or immigrant laborers mattered less than whether it accurately described how heat, mass, and insulation actually functioned. Universities taught theory. Frontiers tested it. Books contained principles. Crises revealed whether those principles worked. And in the end, the most reliable knowledge was that which survived measurement. Thermometers that recorded actual temperature, wood piles that documented actual consumption, and survivors who demonstrated actual comfort in conditions that killed those who dismissed their methods as primitive. By 1890, when William Cobb compiled his regional survey report for the territorial government, he included a technical appendix: Earth-Sheltered Construction in Cold Climates, Thermal Performance Data from Fort Benton Settlements, 1886 to 1889. The document contained temperature measurements, fuel consumption statistics, construction techniques, and cost analyses. It concluded, properly designed earth-sheltered structures achieve 70 to 80% fuel efficiency improvements compared to conventional log cabin construction while providing superior thermal stability and reduced maintenance. Initial labor investment is comparable. Life cycle costs favor earth sheltering significantly. Recommendation: disseminate construction principles to northern settlements. The report was filed, read by perhaps a dozen territorial officials, and largely forgotten. Earth sheltering never became mainstream American architecture. The frontier moved on, railroads arrived, cheap coal replaced scarce firewood, and the pressure that had forced innovation receded. By 1900, most of Fort Benton's earth shelters had been abandoned in favor of conventional houses with modern heating systems. But the knowledge survived. Henri Deschamps taught earth lodge construction to Métis communities across Manitoba. Samuel Bridger's children, grown and homesteading in Saskatchewan, built semi-subterranean shelters that used 60% less fuel than their neighbors' cabins. And Lars Eriksson's original tree pit shelter, maintained and occasionally occupied by transient workers and trappers, remained structurally sound until 1923, 37 years after its construction, requiring no significant repairs, outlasting the log cabins that mocked it by decades. The final irony was recorded in a footnote in Cobb's survey. Of the 11 cabins that stood in Fort Benton in 1886, only 2 remained structurally intact by 1920. Log construction, exposed to Montana's freeze-thaw cycles and temperature extremes, degraded predictably. Chinking failed, logs rotted at ground contact, roofs collapsed under snow loads. The maintenance was endless and expensive. Earth-sheltered structures built into stable soil and protected from weather extremes required almost no maintenance. The earth that Fort Benton's builders had dismissed as primitive, unsuitable for civilized dwelling, proved more durable than their civilized materials. Stone outlasted wood, sod outlasted shingle, and the engineering principles that Lars Eriksson had borrowed from his grandfather, learned from Hidatsa Outers, and refined through measurement proved more reliable than tradition, assumption, and the hierarchy of knowledge that had nearly cost Fort Benton its survival. The thermometer recorded the truth. 35 degrees warmer, 80% less fuel, decades of durability, and a lesson that every generation must relearn, that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. In the end, Lars Eriksson's greatest contribution wasn't the shelter he built, it was the humility he demonstrated. Humility to learn from any source, measure honestly, and trust empirical results over inherited assumptions. That humility, tested by winter and proven by stone, was the warmest shelter of all.